guys, we're back with second half of the video about the Babylonians and the Phoenicians. If you're watching this first and you don't know anything about the Hittites or the Assyrians, then you should go back and watch that other video first. This video is going to pick up where, assuming that we've already talked about that or that you've already listened to it, so please make sure you've watched that one first. Okay, so the Babylonian Empire originally started around 2000 BCE with Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the most famous Babylonian emperor, and after that, Babylon pretty much receded from I don't want to say major importance. They were a major empire in the south of Mesopotamia, but it wasn't really until after the fall of the Assyrian Empire that the Neo-Babylonians kind of come back with a vengeance and make their presence known all the way throughout the region in the Middle East. So they are different in the sense that it is not necessarily the same continuous, say, dynasty or family in charge of Babylon as it was with Hammurabi, but it's still the Babylonian Empire. So a lot of people call this the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Some people call it the Chaldean Empire. But it was a relatively short-lived major empire, but it was very important because it set off a number of chain of events that reverberated through history. So let's talk a little bit about them. So as the Assyrian Empire was at its height, remember they had pretty much all of the land, including Egypt. They had Babylon. They conquered pretty much all of the Middle East, but then it all collapsed. One of the things that caused the collapse was the fact that they believed that if they lost a battle, that the world would end. So they were in this constant expansion of territory because they thought that they needed to keep conquering, and that if they lost a battle, the world would literally come to an end. And when you believe that and lose a battle, then you expect the world to end. And for the Assyrian Empire, it did. In fact, it collapsed, allowing the Neo-Babylonian Empire to kind of fill the gap and take its place. They did so by winning their independence from the Assyrian Empire, but that independence only lasted about 1,000 years before a lot of their empire collapsed and reverted back to that small area, relatively small area in southern Mesopotamia along the Persian Gulf. The most famous ruler of the Neo-Babylonians was a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. What a great name. We should really bring back the name Nebuchadnezzar. It just rolls right off the tongue. It's just a beautiful name, Nebuchadnezzar. Can't say it enough. He was the main ruler for about 40 years at the height of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In fact, it was under his rule that they went out and conquered Egypt, Syria, Phoenicia, and Judah, which, if you know that from your religion classes, led to what we call the Jewish captivity. So that is when Nebuchadnezzar went into Jerusalem and took all the people out of Jerusalem, all the Jews out of Jerusalem, and brought them to Babylon. It's there that the Jewish people are exposed to all of these stories that the Babylonians tell about Gilgamesh, about Sargon, and it is also in Babylonian captivity where the Hebrews write the first few books of the Bible. It is in Babylonian captivity that Genesis and Exodus are written, finally written down, and you can see that there's a lot of this cultural diffusion from borrowing the stories that they're hearing from the Neo-Babylonians. And we'll see another example of that in just a second. And so, again, which tells us that the Neo-Babylonians use the same tactics that the Assyrians did in terms of forced deportation, right? They would move all the people out, spread them around, make it harder for them to organize and rebel. So who knows? Maybe without Nebuchadnezzar II and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we might not even have the Bible because of the stories, or at least the Bible in the form that we have it today would not be the same thing. The Babylonians also brought back the ziggurat. If you remember back when we first started talking about the city-states in Ur, or the city-states in Sumerian city-states, the ziggurat was their main temple, and it's a specific type of building. Otherwise, there's just kind of temples all over the place. But the ziggurat comes back as the main religious building in that region. So, some interesting things. Some historians believe that the ziggurat of Marduk, right? Remember, Marduk is the main god of the city of Babylon, first promoted by my man Hammurabi, uh, could have actually been the Tower of Babel from the Christian Bible, right? The story of the Tower of Babel. So here's an image of what some people believe, or what Renaissance painter believed the Tower of Babel looked like, and it kind of does look like a ziggurat, right? It kind of has the same tiered shape, goes that way. Now think about it this way, right? So if you don't know the story of the Tower of Babel, basically the story goes is that there was this town where people were building a tower all the way up to the gods. They wanted to reach the heavens, and God, in order to prevent them from accomplishing that task as they got close, cursed them with the inability to understand each other. And that is the origin in the Bible of all the world's different languages, right? Because if everybody's coming from Adam and Eve, how are all these different languages developed? So the Bible says that it was the Tower of Babel where God essentially cursed everybody with different languages so they could no longer cooperate to build the Tower of Babel. Now, from a historian standpoint, we know that the Hebrews were in, or Israelites, whichever you prefer, I guess, were in Babylon during during the creation of the new ziggurat of Marduk. So we know that they were there. We know probably would have been the biggest tower building in the city, and thus probably the biggest structure that the refugees from Jerusalem would have ever seen. It would have looked like it went up into the sky. 3. We know that Babylon was a city that was that developed all these trade routes. It was an international city. People came from all over the Middle East to buy and sell goods in Babylon. It was the bustling capital of the region. Uh, think of any other big major port city like New York. There's all these people, or even Philadelphia. There's all these people speaking all these different languages all the time, in and out of each other's presence. So if you're coming from a place where everyone spoke the same language, and all of a sudden you're in this new place where there's this big building that seems to go up into the heavens, and everyone around you is speaking different languages, it's very easy to see how that story can then be created of, oh, maybe this is how all the languages got started. Maybe they were trying to build a tower into heaven, and God cursed everybody with all these different languages that we're hearing. It's a very plausible explanation for the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel story. In fact, Babylon are very similar as well. So, there's some historical evidence here that what was talked about in the Old Testament and the Tower of Babel story was an actual building that historians would have called the Ziggurat of Marduk, and the Babylonians would have called it the Ziggurat of Marduk. Babylonians were also famous for building other monumental architecture, most notably this gate to their city. So, just like every other city in the ancient world, there were walls surrounding it to protect it from raiders, people coming in and taking everything out. And this gate, this is a section of the wall and a gate in and of itself called the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar was the goddess of war and love. Think about that for a little bit, the duality there. But they dedicated all of the gates to the city of Babylon to a specific god or goddess, and this was the Ishtar Gate. The blue stones were made from lapis lazuli, a naturally occurring blue rock. It's very precious in the ancient world, right? That blue color is unique, and it was inlaid with gold and cuneiform writing. The gold was usually used to create mythical animals, whether it's unicorns or dragons or aurochs or those kinds of things, to then like show the mythological side of this. So kind of like landmarks, like you enter in through the Ishtar Gate or the Marduk Gate, whatever. But Ishtar Gate was renowned for its beauty, um, its breathtaking beauty in terms of how it was. It would greet visitors. You'd walk through this. It's kind of like, wow, look at how wealthy the Babylonians are, that they can use all of this precious material just for a gate in their city, right? So this is an image of a reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate. It has since been demolished, but some pictures of it, drawings of it, survive. So this is a recreation of it. I believe this is in a museum in Germany. This image. So that's pretty much the Babylonian Empire. They kind of like the Assyrian Empire, right? Because empires are so hard to maintain. Kind of expanded really quick and then contracted really quick as well. Um, so those are the three big empires of the region, at least that we're going to talk about: the Assyrian Empire, the Hittite Empire, and the Babylonian Empire. Let's talk about a group of people that were very different than all of these warmongering and conquering types, and that's the Phoenicians. Okay, so you can see the Phoenicians have really two areas that were that are highlighted for them. One is in what is modern day like Lebanon, just north of Israel, along the Mediterranean coast there. Let me get my cursors to show you. There's the mouse. Like this area here. But then they also have these what we'll call overseas colonies, the north coast of Africa and the southern coast of Spain, and on Sicily and other areas farther west in the Mediterranean. So think about that, right? They have these overseas areas that none of these other empires did. That should let you know what they were really good at, just by looking at this map. But the Phoenicians are extremely important to our story here because they are responsible for a number of things. First, they were merchant extraordinaires. They were traders who would go from port to port with this, ships full of all of these rare artifacts from all around the Mediterranean world, and they would drop them off and exchange them for gold. That's how they made all their money. It's what allowed for these overseas colonies that, as the Phoenicians kind of set up shop, some of them would stay, and then they would develop these local, colonies that are loyal to the Phoenicians back home. So they kind of had their own empire in a way. It's not a land empire, but it was a sea empire, right, and a trading empire. So whereas the Assyrians and the Babylonians are conquering everywhere, the Phoenicians are doing it through economics, right? They're going out there and buying and selling goods, giving people better ways of life, and that's how they're expanding their territory. The thing that got the Phoenicians started was their purple dye. Purple was a very rare color in the ancient world. If you know anything about the color purple, you might know that it's associated with royalty. That's because it was so expensive. The Phoenicians figured out a way to make purple dye because there were all these sea snails that were in their harbors, and when you crushed them, they oozed out this purple goo, right? Blood, guts, whatever was purple, and you would then take your linen or your fabrics and dye it in that goo, and it turned everything this beautiful shade of purple. Well, it was extremely expensive. Purple dye was, because it was so rare. So the Phoenicians made a lot of money just based off of their geography, right? Based off of the animals that were in their, in the waters off their coast. That then is what allowed them to maintain these overseas colonies and this reputation of being, traders, that they would go around and buy and sell goods and exchange them and do all these other wonderful things that led to economic prosperity in the region. It's a huge driver of cultural diffusion, right? They're going from North Africa to South Spain. There's even some evidence that they made it out into the Atlantic Ocean and up into England, and just brought all of these different groups of people together through their goods and services that they would buy and then sell and trade other places. So the Phoenicians were basically like the ancient middlemen, right? They would buy something and then sell it to someone else and keep the profit. But perhaps the most important thing that the Phoenicians did is they developed an alphabetic writing system. Okay, so all that stuff we talked about, cuneiform, where it's based off of a syllable and each symbol represents a whole word or a part of a word. Instead, the Phoenicians say we're gonna winnow down our spoken language into its basic parts and assign each of them a symbol, thus creating the first alphabet. And the Phoenician alphabet looked like this. So you can see a few things. You can see that this is very similar to the Greek alphabet, if you know anything. So like D delta in Greek is a triangle. The D in the Phoenician language is a triangle as well. You'll notice that M and N kind of look similar to how they look today. I think that's interesting. You'll notice that there are a few different versions of S, right? Because you have like the S sound and you have the sh sound, right? So there's different S sounds that are made. So they had different symbols for those. And they also had pauses built in. So, breaths, or just pauses within the writing, kind of like a hyphen or something that they had symbols for. So think about the difference between an alphabet and like the Phoenicians had and say cuneiform, right? In order to be a scribe in cuneiform, you need to know every single word and what that looks like in cuneiform. It's extremely tedious, right? There's so much stuff that you need to know. Whereas for the alphabet, all you need to know is the basic letters of the alphabet, and then you can combine them to make every word that you possibly could use, right? So uh, I know we talked about this with the cuneiform thing, but you can sound out words. When you were learning to read, if you came across a word you didn't know, you were probably told to sound it out because you would recognize the word. You might not know what it says, but you can recognize the sound of it. So that's only possible because of the Phoenicians and their development of the alphabet writing system. Their alphabet would then go to the Greeks, which would then go to the Romans, which would then spread throughout Europe as the Latin alphabet. And every alphabetic language that exists actually can trace its roots back to this Phoenician one, because this is all an example of cultural diffusion, right? As they spread throughout the Mediterranean, they brought with them things like the alphabet and their dye and all these other goods and services that they had. In fact, the Phoenicians are so important that your grade school language arts class might have even been called phonics, which we get from the Phoenicians, right? That's where that word phonics comes from, and it's where we get the root of the telephone or phone, phonos, sound, right? That's where that comes from, is the Phoenicians. Okay, so that's it for chapter 2. That's it for the Phoenicians and the other Mesopotamian civilizations. So make sure that you guys have been taking notes. In this video, we talked about the NeoBabylonians and the Phoenicians. Remember that the previous video was about the Hittites and the Assyrians, and it would be really important for you to be able to determine the differences between all of these different civilizations, what made them each unique. Okay, guys, that's it for these videos for now. Until next time.